Thank you, Nancy. It's really good to be back here. I was a bookish kid, and so my local library was a place I felt very comfortable. And this very much reminds me of the local library in the suburb that I grew up in New Jersey. Um, it also reminds me a lot of the Astoria Public Library, and that is the place where I first had a serious encounter with the Ku Klux Klan. Uh, Not in person, but through the microfiche that the Astoria Public Library has. Amazing record of all of the newspapers that go way back. The city of Astoria is soaked in history, and one of the biggest pieces of its history is the Klan from the 1920s. I encountered the Klan in the microfiche there after having heard from the people around town about the lore of the Klan in the 1920s. I was actually in Astoria for a marketing project that I was working on. My wife and I were rebranding a hotel, and we were putting a historical spin on it because it was a building that was historical and it was being rehabilitated. And I guess it was being rehabilitated as well because it had been empty for a really, really long time. And so I was sort of the resident historian, and talking to people in Astoria just to get a sense. I didn't really know the city very well. To get a sense of what was going on, just asking people for questions, and the Klan kept coming up and kept coming up. And so I went to the library, and it really, honestly, it very much looks like this. I mean, libraries are great in that sense that you can kind of go to them and just have that automatic sense of place. And what I found was very unusual to me. It struck me that Astoria was an extraordinarily white place, and it was. I already knew that Oregon was an extraordinarily white place, and I didn't yet really know why that was or the connection with the Klan. The Klan came to Astoria in 1922, 100 years ago, and their first meeting was in January of 1922. By the end of that year, in a town of 14,000 people with roughly 3,000 native-born white men who could be members of the Klan. That was the membership pool. The Astoria Klan grew from not existing to 900 members. Roughly 1 in 4 of the eligible adult males joined the Klan within the first year. They succeeded at recalling the sheriff and replacing him with a Klan-friendly sheriff. They succeeded at winning every single city council race and the mayorship in that November's election. No Klan in January, running the city by November. In December, and this was the biggest part of Astoria lore, and some of you probably know this. This is one of the things that is known about Astoria. The entire town burned down in a giant fire that people to this day still suspect was started by the Klan leadership. Now, I found nothing to substantiate that claim, but it was the original kind of rumor. People would just say like, "Oh yeah, the Klan burned the city down." I'm like, "What? What did you say?" And so I was like, how did the Klan make it out here to the very western edge of the country in this extraordinarily white city? And to make it even worse, I looked up the census or not worse, to make it more confusing or perplexing, I looked up the census data for Astoria for 1920. And the population was 14,000. There were 4,700 native-born white males of all ages, about which 3,000 were adults. There were 8 black people. 8. Not very many. There were 8. And there were 530 Japanese, Chinese, Native Americans, and other listed in the census. So there was a slightly larger non-white population. But there were 8 black people in Astoria. What was the Klan doing in Astoria? How did it get so big so quickly and take over? And whether they started the fire or not, it's indisputable that the Klan just took off. Now, I was doing research on Astoria's history, and I started doing more research on the Klan in Oregon and out west, and then nationwide in this period. And nationwide, the Klan was doing extremely well, but it didn't last very long. Nationwide, there were somewhere between 5 and 8 million members of the Klan in the mid-1920s. There are lots of estimates that vary. We know that there were 900 members in Astoria because there were decent records, actually. In Portland, which was a city of, at that time, I think about 200,000, there were 15,000, roughly 15,000 Klansmen in a city that also had an extraordinarily tiny black population. And I was like, what was going on? And then I realized, I'm like, okay, Jack, what do you know? Like, it's 1922, uh, which is now 100 years ago. I did this project about 10 years ago, and so it was not quite 100 years, but like, what did you know about 1922? Well, it was a time of great upheaval and a time of great uncertainty. The foreign-born population of Astoria was huge. It was about 33%, and that was mostly Scandinavians and Russians. So it was a white foreign-born population. But a lot of those people were very, very recent immigrants. Um, then the further I looked into it, and just flipping through the newspapers and the microfiche, I'm seeing ads for magazine, or for excuse me, for motion pictures. It's like, oh, motion pictures were relatively new. Victrola record players. Radio was just brand new at the time. Women had just gained the right to vote. There were cigarette ads aimed at women. It was, from the point of view of certain people, it was a time of great upheaval and great uncertainty. And that is what the Klan latched onto. And that is why the Klan grew so quickly in Astoria. It wasn't about Black people, it was about change. It was about uncertainty. It was about vulnerability. And one of the things that I always get reminded of when I think about this research that I did and this sort of realization, I knew what the Klan was and I knew some things about it, and I understood that the Birth of the Nation, which came out in 1915, helped with the Second Klan. I just knew some things. But as I looked specifically in what happened with 900 white men in this relatively small town, that honestly, if any of you have been out to Astoria, it's kind of unchanged. It's actually a little smaller today than it was back then. The population of Astoria today is about 12,000. It dropped off drastically after the Great Fire of 1922 and very slowly built back up. But in a lot of ways, you can go to Astoria today and feel a little bit like you were walking around in the 1920s. It's like, what was going on with these men? And I ended up writing a historical work of historical fiction centered around a father, and I'm a father. The daughter in the book was at the time a 16-year-old. I now today have a 16-year-old daughter, as well as an 18-year-old son who's sitting there in the back row, actually listening. It's great, paying attention. Even though he hears me talk all the time, and he came over to me, he's like, well, I don't know, I hear you talk all the time, so maybe I will or won't listen. So he's my canary in a coal mine. As soon as he starts reading the book that I just loaned him, I'll know that I've gotten boring. But I was already putting myself in the place. I'm like, what would it have felt like? And this is one of the beautiful things about historical fiction. I know I'm not here to talk about the book, specifically the book that is part of the Lake Oswego Reads, but it is a work of historical fiction that gives us the opportunity to see the problems of a different time through the lens of the characters of the time. And then also we can't help but bring all of our own ideas and views. And so I thought myself, I'm like, what would a man, a white man like myself, with a teenage daughter in 1922 in Astoria, why would that person be drawn to the Klan? And I very quickly was just like, movies, radio, cigarettes, flappers, speakeasies. And it didn't take me long to map those disruptions onto social media, streaming internet, marijuana, meth, fentanyl, which actually fentanyl not at the time, but now, like, there were so many things. And then the parallels go even deeper, right? Especially now. There had just been a global pandemic. The world had just lived through a summer of race-based riots. There was a flood of uncertainty and vulnerability in a population of people who were not used to that. White men, primarily in Astoria anyway, middle-class white men who were not at all used to that. And what the Klan did was pointed out to these men that they had a problem. They knew they felt something. And the newspapers at the time, kind of the editorials and the articles showed that there was this sense. The Klan said, we know what your problem is. It's foreigners. It's Catholics. It's immigrants. It's not Black people. The Oregon Klan, of course, demonized Black people like the Klan does, but that was a super sideline. It was others. Anyone who's not you. And who were the others? Well, in Astoria, the others were foreign-born whites. Were they socialists or were they just hardworking immigrants? Yes, there were both of those. But from the Klan's point of view, they were others. The Klan, like many entities throughout history that promulgates racist views and intolerant views, they saw a problem and had a solution that was available for it. And what I want to talk about today, I've already spent quite a bit of my time talking already. I've already spent 15 minutes just warming up, is I want to talk about the relationship between uncertainty, vulnerability, and this otherizing process as it has played out here in the West Coast. And the three examples I wanted to talk about are the Oregon Constitution, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which actually I'm surrounded by placards doing the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Japanese internment. I'm not going to go into detail in any of these. I want to sort of bring them up as examples of a time when a powerful force of otherizing addressed a problem. Now, it wasn't always the same problem. And that's one of the things that when you look back at history through the lens of weird, bad, horrible, immoral, intolerant, ugly things that happened, why did they happen? Right? And I think a lot of times you can say, well, what problem did that existed that they addressed, that they solved? In my talk last year, I talked about the establishment of racist attitudes in colonial America, and there were a lot of things that went on in the 1600s that led to slavery and led to the establishment of black-white racism in America, particularly in the South. But one of the biggest was essentially an economic problem. It was, how do we get the labor force that we need to come to this barren place that we are starting to make even more barren by getting rid of the Native American population. And we want to be able to turn this wonderland of natural resources into wealth. So racism actually addressed, or I shouldn't say addressed, racism actually helped solve the problem of how to attract, keep a workforce, and how to make sure that an extraordinarily wealthy and tiny elite didn't get overrun by all of the people that either came voluntarily, as some of the European whites did, or who were forcibly brought there, as the African American slaves did, to keep them from essentially rising up and destroying the entire operation. So racism solved that problem, and in a way, it was an extraordinarily sinister and yet brilliant answer to the question of how can we exploit the natural resources of this continent that we're pretty effectively taking over. Now, because the book for this year is about California, the gold rush, the West Coast, I thought, I was like, well, okay, what was the same and what was different? Was it the same problem that was being solved out west? And it wasn't really. There was not a labor shortage that required some kind of transfer of human power from the East Coast or Africa or Europe or South America to the American West to ensure the ability. There was an awful lot of people who were coming voluntarily, and there were all kinds of technological advances that were making it easier and easier for those people to get here. So it wasn't the same problem. Yet there was a similar solution. And I think that's one of the things about racism, is that it actually solves, for the people who plant it and spread it, it solves multiple problems. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so prominent in history, and why it's so difficult to root out, and why it's so frustrating, because it just seems so wrong. And what problem does it solve? Well, in Astoria, it solved the problem of this uncertainty and this like spike in vulnerability among a population of people who just weren't used to feeling vulnerable and really, really, really didn't like it, and were happy to receive the message that these foreigners, these Catholics, that they were bad, wrong, less human, less American, less valuable than they were. And whatever our moral evaluation of that message is, analytically, we can look at that and say, yeah, that worked, right? And I think that we can learn from the Astoria example. And when I first started writing this book in 2015, it was the month before Donald Trump rode down the golden elevator or the golden escalator to announce his candidacy. And as I was doing the research and doing the writing and seeing what was going on in Astoria in the 1920s, the parallels not only just arose, but they got even stronger. And now that, of course, that we've lived through a global pandemic and we now have another war, and there's the type of uncertainty and vulnerability that certain people are facing is even more acute and even more in our faces. That was the problem that was solved. The Oregon Constitution, which was a weird document because Oregon came into the Union as a free state. The voters of Oregon had a choice, and actually they had two choices when the Constitution came up for ratification. Choice A was free state or slave state, and by an overwhelming majority, the voters chose to be a free state. Choice B, which was an option that would only kick in if the free state provision passed, was should black people be allowed in Oregon, yes or no? And by an overwhelming majority, the answer was no. The original Oregon Constitution, as I think more and more people are becoming aware, sort of the racist history of Oregon has gotten a lot of coverage in the last decade. The original Oregon Constitution made it illegal for black people to be in Oregon. Why, right? Why a free state that banned black people? Well, to me, there's a lot that went on in that, but I think that it stems from what problem did Oregon solve for the people who voted on that Constitution, for the early settlers, for the people who took the Oregon Trail. Right? The Oregon Trail, there's been some really great work on how hard and brutal and difficult that was. And I think that when I think about the pioneers, I'm just like, wow, those people were pretty heroic, right? And that's not wrong. But what a lot of them were doing was solving a problem. And that problem was, one, a racially tumultuous society back east. They didn't like it, right? Racial conflict in the United States was, in the 1840s and 1850s when the Oregon Trail was first getting started and then flooding with people, was, I don't even know if we can understand. I don't know that I can fully understand what it must have felt like to live in the United States in the 1850s in terms of racial conflict and the ugliness of it. The run up to the Civil War. So people who took the Oregon Trail, a lot of them, they just wanted out. They wanted to get away from that. They were not coming here to settle a free state. They were coming here to get away from racial conflict. And what they didn't want was racial conflict, and so they didn't want black people. And it wasn't that they were necessarily deeply racist so much as they wanted peace, tranquility. Many of the farmers, particularly those who came from the Missouri and Tennessee, that area, they were not slaveholders. A few slaveholders came out here and brought slaves with them, but most of the migrants were not slaveholders. And the other problem they were solving for themselves was their inability to compete with slave-holding agricultural operations. So it was both a social and personal problem, racial conflict, that was ugly, and just to escape it must have felt pretty good, right? Like to get on the Oregon Trail, but it couldn't have been an easy decision. But also like, okay, we're leaving behind something pretty ugly and unpleasant and bad and potentially life-threatening. And anyone who saw the Civil War coming was right about it. They were also solving just a straightforward economic problem. How can we actually be non-slaveholders and compete in an agricultural market? So Oregon was a great place, and the Willamette Valley particularly. I mean, the Willamette Valley is lush and beautiful, and it must have just been awesome to get here, right? And to be free from racial conflict and being outcompeted by large plantation owners who were using slaves. And so problem solved, right? Problem solved. But of course, you have to keep black people out in order to keep that solution sustainable. And so the Oregon Constitution, free state, bans black people. Now, this is not to say, and I know that sometimes when I talk about stuff like this and when I talk about the Klan from the 1920s, even to myself, I can sound like I'm making excuses or rationalizing immoral or ugly behavior. And I definitely don't want to convey that message. Analytically, they solved a problem, and we can understand that, and we can even say, well, okay, that was a solution. And we can understand the motivation. We can still morally condemn it at the same exact time. And I think that that's one of the things that is challenging to do. If there's something that we understand, we can explain it, we understand the motivations, it can seem like, well, we're morally accepting it. Or if we morally condemn something, we have to then say the people who did it were monsters, right? I like to find that balance between saying, yeah, this was morally horrible, and yet it was analytically understandable. And that's the examples that I put in the description for the talk, and that I'm going to move through the two more of them. I think have that same character, morally reprehensible, but understandable as a solution to a particular kind of problem. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which, the information is about it, and this is one of those where I don't think I have to do a whole lot of describing for people to know what the Chinese Exclusion Act was. But the question then would be, what problem was the Chinese Exclusion Act solving? And what's interesting is that when you're going to exclude immigrants who are part of a cheap workforce in a newly developing territory, California, and there were some Chinese in Oregon and Washington as well, but mainly it was in California. Why would you want to exclude a workforce, a cheap, easily exploited workforce, a politically powerless workforce? Why would you want to do that? That doesn't make sense, right? Well, that's because the problem was not how do we get an adequate workforce to develop this newly developing state. The problem was, how do we not allow the large and growing workforce of white miners, or I shouldn't say white miners, of miners and settlers to become, how do we let them not become unruly? And one of the classic solutions to a problem of unruly populations, give them something to hate that isn't you, right? And that was actually, this is where that solution maps onto the solution that plantation owners came upon in the 1600s in the American South, in the Chesapeake region, which was, well, we have everything, and there's only a few of us, and if they start to hate us, then we're in big trouble, right? So how do we make sure that the people who could tear down our lifestyle and our economic accomplishments, how do we make sure they don't turn on us? That's where the otherizing comes in. Give them something to hate, right? In the case of the Klan coming to Astoria in 1920, it was a different solution. It was a different problem. It wasn't a problem of exploiters trying to distract hatred from themselves to a different group. It was opportunists looking to essentially gain political power by pointing to a group that the vulnerable, the confused, the uncertain, the scared could say, you're the problem. And there was a different dynamic underneath of it. The Chinese Exclusion Act, though, was more of a, how do we make sure that this large and growing population of migrants, internal migrants who are coming out to California to mine gold, to farm the land, to set up shops in growing towns and growing cities, how do we make sure those people don't look at the bosses and say, wait a minute, we're doing all the work and you're getting all the benefits? And the age-old solution, and a solution that was borrowed very much from the American South, was just hate those people over there. I know I'm painting with a very broad brush, and I expect that possibly during the Q&A, people will want to poke me on some more specifics. But to me, that's the main solution, right? That's the main reason for the Chinese Exclusion Act. It doesn't make sense from the point of view of we need a big labor force, but it does make sense from the point of view of our problem is not the size of the labor force. Our problem is the potential unruliness of the labor force. Give them somebody to hate. Create distinctions. And in the case of the Chinese Exclusion Act, in the case of the slave codes in the Chesapeake region in the 1600s, there was skin color that was a very easy thing to point to. Otherizing is a challenging task, because what you are doing is trying to convince people to hate somebody that really if they looked around objectively, wouldn't be the ones to hate. But when you can point to skin color, it literally draws the eye, and it makes it easier to keep that focus. The Klan came and went in Oregon and outside the South of the United States in the 1920s very quickly, because since there wasn't skin to point to and hold the attention. If you were walking around Astoria in 1922, you couldn't tell by looking who the foreign-born whites were. You couldn't tell who the Finnish socialists were. Until you started talking to them, right, and following them to their clubhouses. But you couldn't just have that. And so you could solve the problem of vulnerability and uncertainty and fear of this white middle-class population. But when you don't have skin color to point to, it really does, historically, it fizzles out much more quickly. My third example, and then I'm going to leave time for questions. And I think actually probably for the first time in my life, I'm actually on the schedule that I set for myself. My third example is the Japanese internment. And again, this is I would say a widely known historical event that I don't have to go into the details of. But through the lens of what I'm talking about, what was the problem that was being solved? This was another example, even more acute, of uncertainty, right? Imagine what it must have felt like to learn of the attack on Pearl Harbor. I think everyone in this room, except for my son, was alive on September 11th, 2001. And that was, the parallels break down in certain ways, but for sure, the uncertainty. And I remember looking at the sky. A lot of us were looking at the sky going, are there more? What's next? What's going to happen? How is this going to play out? As the anthrax scares in Washington, D.C. went on, these are things that I actually, until I try to recall exactly what was going on in the fall of 2001, I'm like, oh, that's right, anthrax. We had no idea what was going to happen, how big this was. We didn't know that essentially it was confined to these 4 planes, and that in a way they were way more successful than they ever believed they were going to be. That there were engineering reasons why the Twin Towers went down in a way that the terrorists really themselves had no idea that it was going to happen. But I am able to, because of that personal experience, use my historical imagination to imagine what it must have felt like to live in the United States, and particularly to live in the Northwest or on the West Coast after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And so here we have, unlike in Astoria in the early 1920s, I think a kind of a multi-front, slow creeping uncertainty and vulnerability. You have an instant acute form of vulnerability. And given that the attack was perpetrated by a nation of people whose skin color and physical features could be identified, the problem of how do we address people's uncertainty, how do we address people's fear, racism could be used to solve that problem, right? If the attack had been perpetrated by Russians, it would have been very much more difficult to say, well, we need to round up all the Russians on the West Coast and put them into internment camps. First of all, you wouldn't necessarily be able to recognize them, and to the extent that Russians could hide their accent or hide their country of origin, they could have evaded it, right? So certain kinds of uncertainty, certain kinds of vulnerability, certain kinds of economic problems, certain kinds of we need you to hate somebody so you don't hate us, can't be solved by racism. But where they can be, they will be. And this is one of the things I think that is so horrifying about racism, is that it shouldn't be a solution to a problem. It shouldn't be something that can be turned to as a tactic to achieve some kind of goal of power, of wealth, of control, of security. But it is. And when it's available as a solution, there will be some people who will pick up that solution and will implement it. Even if the vast majority of people don't, because it's abhorrent, because it's wrong, because what's the difference between me and someone who has different skin color or different shape of eye or different national origin or a different accent? A lot of people could say that. But the few people who are willing to accept the moral ugliness of a racist project, they will do it. And because problems that are very powerful, I think, have a tendency to need to get solved. This is one of the things that's both amazing about human beings and horrible about human beings, is that when we're faced with problems, we solve them. And the bigger the problem, the more dedicated to solving them we are going to be. Unfortunately, often our solutions create new problems and sometimes worse problems, right? My first talk here 2 years ago was about climate politics and the climate crisis. And the thing about the climate crisis is it is a problem that is the result of an extraordinarily successful solution, right? How do we, a species of beings that are, like all species, vulnerable to competition, vulnerable to extinction, vulnerable to hunger, vulnerable to being driven out of ecosystems, how do we get rid of this vulnerability? Well, our ability to be productive, to turn natural resources into things that we can eat and shelter ourselves with and create energy and create comfort, all of that is a huge solution to the problem of our physical vulnerability to this environment that is essentially doesn't care whether we live or die or not. And so this is one of those things that we as a species solve our problems that are right in front of us. The bigger the problem, the more dedicated we're going to be to solving it. We're not necessarily a species that says, I wonder if that solution is going to create a problem that's worse than the problem we're solving. Or even that says, I wonder if it's going to create a big new problem that we could possibly hear at the beginning of this try to mitigate. And I think that racism is sometimes very perplexing to people. Why is it that this works? Why is it that these ideas that certain kinds of people are inferior can be treated in ugly, inhumane ways? How does that work, right? It works because of this lack of foresight of these horrible consequences and because of our drive as a species to solve problems. And unfortunately, it can, in a number of circumstances, be the solution to a problem. It's not racism is not the solution to every problem. I mean, there's the soundbite that's going to destroy my political career if I ever have one. Racism is not the solution to every problem, right? Like, I hope you know that I don't mean that it's a good solution. Racism can't be turned to by those who are seeking to, for example, immunize themselves from the hatred of the people that they're exploiting. But when it can be, it will be utilized. Okay, thanks for your attention. I know I speak quickly, and it's possible that I've gone off the rails in any number of different directions. So I would love to take questions now. And Nancy has a microphone that she can let you use so that I can hear your questions so we can get it recorded.
So there was that 20-year or 30-year hiatus between when the Klan was actually stopped by the president in the 20s. But then it arose again in the 50s and the 60s. Did it arise in Oregon as well? Did the Klan come back again or no?
No. The thing that was interesting about, and people often call it the second Klan, because the first Klan were the racist terrorist organization in the Reconstruction era of the South. The second Klan was the only version of the Klan that was national. The third Klan in the 1950s was very much centered around this racial conflict in the civil rights movement. And so it did not come back to Oregon. And what was interesting is that it wasn't a time of vulnerability and uncertainty for every American, right? It was a time of vulnerability and uncertainty for white Americans in the segregationist South. And so when the Klan came back, it's because there was the opportunity for it. But yeah, the Klan in the 1920s Klan in Oregon is a shameful piece of our history, but it was not repeated. So we can at least take pride in the fact that we didn't give it a second shot. I don't know if that's a weird form of pride. I try to find Oregon pride whenever I can because I'm a proud Oregonian. So that's maybe a weird place to look for it.
First of all, I really appreciate you putting it in perspective of a problem to be solved. When I feel so overwhelmed by some of the things that are going on nowadays, if I look at it, I hadn't thought of that. It makes me feel more buoyant.
Well, that makes me happy to hear.
Yeah, it does. And you were saying at the beginning that they fizzled out pretty quickly, and I was thinking, oh, why? But then, and I thought maybe there's something I can use nowadays. But then you said because the others were white immigrants. I'm like, oh.
Right. Well, there was one other piece of the fizzling, and this happened very quickly in Astoria, and it happened in Portland, and then it started to happen nationwide, is that the Klan turned out to be a massively corrupt organization that used their political power for completely personal corrupt gains. both the Morrison Bridge and the Hawthorne Bridge in Portland were built on endpoints that were bought up by Klan members who got inside information from the Klan-run city council about where, and I think it was actually the Multnomah County Commission, where the bridges were going to be sited. And this kind of thing came out very quickly. In Astoria, whether the Klan burned the city down or not, what did happen was that immediately upon taking power, the Klan mayor and city council began giving out public contracts at inflated rates to Klan-affiliated businesses. And that kind of corruption led to the fizzling out. But what it also, one of the reasons why it fizzled out was because there was not this ability to continue the fear and the hatred and the pointing at the people that sort of originally riled up the membership. By the end of 1924, there was no more Astoria Klan, and the Astoria Klan rose and fell more quickly than the Klan organizations in other parts of Oregon and in the rest of the country. The trajectory was faster, I think, because it was a faster rise. It was a smaller city, and there really, literally were no black people. There were 8 black people. I can only imagine maybe those 8 black people actually left, right? Even I don't know what the count was in 1922. There wasn't a census, but there was corruption that led to it, and part of it was that the Klan was an opportunity for corrupt people to sneak in to power. Most of the members, as far as I can tell, most of the members of the Astoria Klan were not corrupt people. But when you have a huge rise, some opportunists can kind of slip in the side door. And that happened to the Portland Klan. It happened to the Oregon Klan in a widespread way. Did I answer your question? Okay. Sometimes I lose track. My son is laughing because he knows this is true.
I had a question. So the Klan dissolved in Oregon, you're saying, were they replaced by another group that shared similar beliefs in terms of racism and white supremacy?
No, and this is one of the sort of bizarre things about Oregon's racist past is that because of the success of essentially making Oregon an unfriendly place for black people in the original Constitution, we've had an extraordinarily small minority population throughout our entire history. And so racism hasn't, we have a racist past, but it's not a directly daily ugly racism because there hasn't been racial conflict. Now, that's not true because entirely true because what happened in World War II when a large population of African Americans moved to Portland to get involved with World War II shipping, the whole Vanport situation. I don't know a ton about what went on there. There was the possibility that Oregon was going, and Portland particularly, was going to have a huge influx of African Americans, and that we would have had a city our size really ought to be more diverse than it is. And it could have happened, and I don't know enough about how that problem that white people in Portland were like, oh no, we're going to lose this placidity. But part of my feeling anyway is that the original white settlers who wanted to create a place without racial conflict, not because they loved all people of all colors, but because they just wanted to leave it behind, they succeeded well enough that a lot of Oregonians actually can justifiably feel like, well, we're not racist. And it's, in a way, that's a privilege because the racist past has prevented us from having high levels of racial conflict. No, go ahead. I was done.
Still is conflict. Like the Exclusionary Act was eliminated in 1943. We had redlining. We had all sorts of stuff.
Right.
And even, when I look at the laws against asylum seekers and stuff, that is very discriminatory.
Right, and just even things like the placement of the Coliseum and where I-5 went through the only African American community in Portland. The thing about those kinds of tactics of retaining white power is that because the minority community was actually relatively small, and most people in Oregon didn't see these kinds of things, right? Like it's taking a lot of educational effort to make Portlanders realize that something as seemingly straightforward as the placement of I-5 and the placement of the Coliseum, that actually was an intentional tactic to displace the only vibrant African American community. and that could be made relatively invisible because there wasn't a large enough, vibrant enough minority population where we would end up, say, with race riots, or where we would end up with a lot of attention being paid to these efforts. So one of the things I think that Oregon has coasted on, in a way, is with a really, I mean, in 2013, that's the last time I saw data, the Black population of Oregon was 2%, right? And I think it's 12% nationwide. 2% is like, you can utterly brush under the rug the racism of redlining, the racism of exclusion, the racism of just hiring, when there aren't a lot of Black people around, so that good-hearted white people don't say to themselves, "Are we being racist?" Right? When redlining was particularly insidious because it's largely invisible to almost everybody, right? You don't know, as a white person living in a neighborhood, that you're being protected by redlining, and so those kinds of maintenance forms of racism, I think, were very successful. Unfortunately, very successful. And the original Oregon Constitution, there wasn't a whole lot of enforcement, and there were actually, before Oregon became a state, there were exclusion laws, and there wasn't a lot of enforcement of it. But the message was, Black people are unwelcome in Oregon, and so don't come here. And that message was well received. And I think that even to this day, that message of, like, if you're a Black American and you want to go somewhere, like, Oregon isn't necessarily the place for you. Now, that may be changing now because we're undergoing such rapid growth, and Portland particularly is a very promising place for people to come to. But I think that the maintenance racism, if I can be so glib as to call it maintenance racism that Oregonians, white Oregonians participated in during the 20th century, was relatively easy to keep hidden from the population as a whole, so that most white Oregonians, and we're a very progressive state, right? Most white Oregonians didn't have to actually say, "Am I a racist?" And I think that that's actually culturally one of the things that has quietly helped perpetuate essentially the massive white identity that Oregon has. I mean, it's weird to me that Oregon is, we're like the 11th whitest state. We're up there with South Dakota and Utah and Oklahoma, like places that you just, like, I don't think of Oregon as being just super white, but it totally is. And that was a result of the original Constitution, and then this century long of relatively unseen maintenance.
We have
yeah.
a lot of, I think, structural elements, from healthcare to criminal justice system, education systems, that disproportionately impact people negatively.
Right.
And there's discriminatory practices
Yeah.
there. And I think some of it is racism, although I think there's other elements or factors that, like you mentioned, in terms of dealing with, say, an emotion where people are uncertain and fearful and they want something to blame, or there might be some economic thing. Because when we were talking about, for example, the Exclusion Act really did not stem from the labor issue, then stuff that I read seems to go against that, because they were saying that there was a labor shortage. There were certain jobs that the predominant group did not want to do.
Right.
So they wanted to bring in, like, the Chinese people who would make the coal, splitting the wood. That was very labor intensive, very hard work, and they could not get enough people to.
Well, and then there's a sense too that sometimes the official policy that's under enforced, because really you don't want to exclude immigrants who will work for way less and who can be exploited much more easily. But I think that the dominant problem in California was not a labor shortage, because people were coming, right? There weren't enough workers at certain points, but people were coming, and it was and the population growth of California was, I would say, in a way, inevitable. But as I say, I was painting with a very broad brush, and there were definitely a lot of different things that were going on. But I think that for me, the Chinese Exclusion Act, I see it more as the solution to the problem of class warfare and exploitation. than the problem of, say, vulnerability of the white majority. And I see it as more of a problem of maintaining the ability of mine owners and railroad owners and large shipping companies to continue to have their dominance over the white exploited working class, so that, and this was the problem in the South too originally, is like, if poor white farmers and black slaves united, it would have been over for the white overlords. And so racism was part of the overall tactic to divide and conquer. And I think that the Chinese Exclusion Act was also, but it's a good point too, that sometimes the costs of an effective solution, there are costs to it, right? To the extent that the Chinese Exclusion Act did actually stem a tide of what would have been easily exploited, low-cost labor for a fast-developing place like California, there was a cost to California's development. I tend to think that when we can see a cost like that, there was a hidden benefit that outweighed that more obvious cost. And as all, I should say this at the beginning. Honestly, I could be wrong. I bring these things up, and I use this lens of like what problem is being solved and what tactics we use to solve those problems as a way of trying to make sense of things that might not be so obvious. So I will admit that possibly, this is, I hate to say it, especially with my son listening, I might not be right. Have we used our time? Oh no, it's only 7:50. More questions? I'll try to be more succinct in answering.
I know that for the Japanese that were in Oregon, when they took, like, our third book in Lake of the Reef was the Southern Twig, and they took the land from the Japanese farmers in Hood River. And in California, they took a lot of the really good farms that the Japanese people had. Did they get those back? I don't think they did.
No, there were reparation payments that were authorized in somewhere in the 70s or 80s, but no, there was not 85. There was not a replacement of, and it was certainly not equal value. No, and that also, like, one of the things about the Japanese internment was, and this was true for 9/11. For some people, these acute crises that make people scared are like the best opportunity possible, right? And the passage of the Patriot Act, this is one of the things I talk about in my political science classes. The Patriot Act was passed in 11 days. Now, that is not only blisteringly fast to pass a piece of major legislation, but how did you even write it in 11 days? And the way that it was written in 11 days was simply cutting and pasting from all of these bills that were on the wish list of law and order conservatives for a decade at least, right? From about the late 80s, but mostly from the early 90s. People like Rudy Giuliani, who was sort of the law and order mayor of New York, they already had a bunch of legislative language that was written up that was just try to cut and paste it, like drag the mouse, keep dragging, Control X, Control V. There it is. There's the Patriot Act. That's how the Patriot Act got written. And it got passed in 11 days because of the absolute fear that Americans were feeling. But to write a bill in 11 days, it wasn't. It was written in 15 years and put together in 11 days. And so to me, that's a perfect example of the opportunism, right? And there were genuinely people who were just like, whoa, terrorism. Who knew what a big problem it was? We need to do something about this. But then there were other people who were just like, ooh, yeah. I don't buy, we're all Americans. We all hear the conspiracy theories. I don't buy the conspiracy theory that Dick Cheney cooked it all up so that they can do all this stuff. But I do believe that they weren't foolish enough to not take advantage of the opportunity. You're like, ooh, I want to pass all these things. I want to take the fetters off of police in various ways. I want to integrate the various policing organizations into something like the Department of Homeland Security. We want to get rid of all of these restrictions on surveillance. Like, this is an opportunity, and only fools don't take advantage of opportunities. And sometimes, unfortunately, those opportunities are based on people's massive amounts of suffering. When I look at political history, in instances like that, I see a combination, and this is what I see in Astoria in the 1920s, a combination of good-hearted people who are worried about something and opportunists. And the good-hearted people, like the character in Invisible Empire, I'll promo my book here, is it's at the risk of making the Klan seem sympathetic, I decided to choose a character who genuinely was concerned about the world his teenage daughter was growing up into, right? And he gets involved in some ugliness and becomes a monster, but starts off as a good-hearted, concerned parent. And for me, it was really kind of a thought experiment on like what does it take to get 900 out of a 3,000 native-born white men in Astoria to join the Klan, right? A terrorist hate group, right? To get that many, seemingly regular people to join a terrorist hate group. How did that happen? A lot of those people were good-hearted. A lot of the people who pushed for the Patriot Act were good-hearted people who wanted to protect Americans from terrorism, who were concerned about our homeland security. And then that's where the opportunists can sneak in. That's where the people who have stock in defense companies, and that's where the people who want to pass the Patriot Act and unfetter the police. That these moments of acute uncertainty and vulnerability are opportunities for certain opportunists who can smuggle themselves in among the truly good-hearted people, right? And I think that politics is a mixture of a lot of good-hearted people and immoral opportunists. And it doesn't take very many immoral opportunists to make bad things happen. Yeah. So are you feeling bad again now? You said you were feeling buoyant. Am I bringing you down? I have a tendency to create an emotional roller coaster. I don't necessarily want to do that, but I think that's just kind of what happens.
So I guess this is more of an observation. More of an observation in looking at our country today and groups that, as we watch people storm the Capitol and everything, and you look at those groups and you go, what do they hate so much? And I guess your observation about opportunism is, and then where you say maybe good-hearted people with some, opportunists sneaking in, but I'm not sure where the good-heartedness is in our division today.
Yeah, and the opportunists don't always sneak in. Sometimes the opportunists are out front. Sometimes the opportunists are Donald Trump.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've had to do for the last 6 years is walk into college classrooms, I teach American politics, and try to make sense for young people of how the hell this happened, right? I was actually teaching parties and elections class, fall of 2016, my first term at PSU, and the class met on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 a.m. And the Wednesday class, the day after the election, I had to walk into the class, and a number of the students had clearly and obviously been crying hard the moment before. And I walked in, and 30 young people just looked up at me with, how did it happen? And ever since then, I've had to be asking myself, how did this happen? I think one of the things I try to remember or try to go back to, what would be the motivations for voting for Donald Trump? What would be the motivations for supporting somebody who is a misogynist and a narcissist and a racist and all of the things? Whether he is any of those things or not, he certainly plays a good role. And more and more, I see the suffering and the vulnerability and the uncertainty that drives that, right? I see what I saw when I started looking into the Klan in Astoria in the early 1920s. I saw people who were not used to feeling vulnerable. I saw people who were not used to worrying about their privilege, seeing their privilege going away, or seeing that it was already gone, right? If you are a 30-something or 40-something white male in the Rust Belt, right? It's your father and uncles who had the good blue-collar jobs, who could support a middle-class family on a blue-collar single income, right? And you've never had that, but you saw it, and you would love to not have the vulnerability that you now have of not having the secure world that the previous generation of blue collar, high school educated white men had, right? I see, and then the idea that people hear statistics like, well, Social Security fund is running out, and white people are going to be in the minority in the country in a couple decades, and the planet is melting. Like, just you don't have to go very far into the doom scrolling social media news feed to feel vulnerable as hell, right? And so I think that the intensity, and this is the big difference between the 1920s and the 2020s, is that like it's relentless. It is absolutely relentless, the vulnerability. And so I think there's just a ton of suffering. And when people support political programs that I find abhorrent, I tend to see that there's suffering behind that. Now, I think that the people who support the political programs that I think that are good, there's also suffering that we're trying to address, right? Suffering and vulnerability and uncertainty, loss of privilege, all of these things, or lack of privilege your whole life and your whole existence. If you're a non-white American, especially if you're a non-white woman, especially if you're a non-heteronormative non-white, like you've never had privilege to lose. And so you're just used to vulnerability and uncertainty. And so I can totally see why people could follow certain leaders in that direction. I think that I make the most sense out of the rise of Donald Trump and of the continued support is that there's just a lot of suffering. And when you're suffering and you don't even necessarily know why, or you have an inkling that it's just too big to deal with, right? Like if there's textile jobs aren't coming back. The secure high school educated blue collar single family middle class, that's not coming back. And the communities that were built around that and the lifestyles that were built around that, for the people who have experienced the loss of that, that's traumatizing. And I don't, again, to get back to I can understand. It doesn't mean I morally accept, like, oh, okay, so supporting Donald Trump is morally neutral, right? Like, I still think that a lot of the things that people who support him do are morally reprehensible. But I get it. It's just like, yeah, if you feel screwed, you're not wrong. If you feel like the future is uncertain and that you don't know what kind of world your kids are growing up into, yeah, I absolutely understand that form of like helpless vulnerability. And the thing that makes me not buoyant is I wonder, like, what could reverse the trend of increased suffering? Like, millions of Americans increasingly are just basically going, and I shouldn't say just because we're still in it, but like we've just all gone through 2 years of a daily trauma as well. And so we all know better than ever, all of us, every single one of us knows uncertainty, suffering, like when's the next, variant coming? There's another, the subvariant, is like, I was just like, I'm definitely one of those people who's just like, please let this pandemic be over, right? And then I see out of the corner of my eye and the news feed, I'm like, God damn it, there's a subvariant, another one, right? Like yeah, we are so like we are like, if you're tired and you just want someone with a simple solution to come along and just say, please just fix it for me, I think we all get it way better than we got it 2 years ago. But even in 2016 and 2017, I was like, okay, there are people who think Donald Trump's morally reprehensible. If you're a good-hearted Christian conservative, you can't look at a person like Donald Trump and think he's a moral exemplar, right? But if he's a person who you think could possibly do things that will relieve your suffering, you can excuse that, right? Human beings do have an awful lot of capacity to morally rationalize things. And I think that's to get back to like, why does racism kind of consistently come up as a solution when it's available, when skin color can be utilized? It's because humans are also pretty good at rationalizing, especially the more pain we face, the more uncertainty, the more vulnerability in our daily lives, I think the more apt we are to rationalize what those solutions happen to be. It's like, to get back to redlining, it's like, I don't necessarily not want black people in my neighborhood, but like, if that's going to hurt my property values and the only thing holding up my middle class lifestyle and to give something to my children is the value of my house, then maybe I don't want black people to come into the neighborhood, right? Like I don't mind, but if other people won't buy my house for the value that they would buy it if there's black people in the neighborhood, then maybe I'll look the other way while redlining goes on. Like I don't think that's morally acceptable, but I understand why that kind of thing happens.
Or like she says, there are some jobs that nobody wants to do.
Yeah.
And now it's the Latinos that are doing the jobs that nobody will do. And Trump wanted to build a wall and keep them out.
Well, and then it's an interesting thing. This is where there are cross currents because if you demonize immigrants, but then don't want to pay $10 a pound for grapes, then you're kind of caught in a bind, right? If you're facing a labor shortage, but you also want to demonize foreigners so that you can make the exploited workers hate them instead of hate you, the exploiter, then like there's a trade-off involved. And I think a lot of times part of what a powerful form of xenophobia or racism or hatred of anything, hatred of gay people, hatred of bearded liberal professors destroying people's minds, it allows you to forget about what those trade-offs are. I will have to say, I do have to say that my experience of the South, my son's name was born in Mississippi, and I went down to Mississippi to teach.
Either, by the way.
Yeah.
Your reaction is my reaction.
Yeah. He was born in Mississippi because my wife and I were like, let's just go to Mississippi and see what it's like. I was greeted as a northern liberal atheistic devil down there to bend the minds of good young people. I was greeted that way, and I was really surprised actually at how powerful the sense was. Because I've lived in a bunch of different places in America, and being a professor, there is always this kind of like, oh, you're a bunch of liberals and you got the beard and you're just hippies and whatever. Like, you're not doing anything productive. But in Mississippi, there really was a palpable sense of you are going to change people's minds in a way that's going to destroy our community. And it's funny because I'm glad I did it, because not only did I see that it was real, but I got it. I was like, your community is valuable to you. Your way of life, the fact that your children want to stay here and grow up in this place and keep going to the same church and raise your grandchildren right around you, like there's a valuable, beautiful thing that you are protecting. I don't like how you're protecting it. I don't like being judged in this way. I'm not as much of an atheistic devil as you possibly think I am, but I get what you're afraid of losing. And for me personally, that was a great experience in understanding how it is that stuff that I don't like comes from a source of like something that is really valuable. Because a lot, the pain of watching the town that your parents and your grandparents grew up in, and the church that you went to, and the community that you think is really a great place, to watch that go away because of loss of textile jobs and globalization and social media and kids moving away to colleges and learning liberal ideas and deciding that it's okay to be gay. Like it's tolerance has a price for these communities, and it makes it understandable to me why people would resist, because it's painful. It's painful to see.
So were you teaching in Mississippi?
I was, yes.
Okay.
I was teaching political science and philosophy, and I was the faculty advisor for the College Democrats, which
Was it you and like one other person? How many other people?
It was me originally, because they were like, this guy looks like he's stupid enough to be the faculty advisor for the College Democrats, and then another faculty member was like, okay, I guess I'll join too, and then I moved out, and I felt bad because I was abandoning some of the students there, but I was like, I got to get out. I can't raise my kid in Mississippi. It's just not my community, right? Like, it's somebody else's community, but it wasn't my community, and I was greeted as essentially a hostile outsider, and like I didn't like it. It was not pleasant to feel like a hostile outsider, but I came to understand why I was seen as a threat. I thought I was bringing, just open-mindedness, political history, good explanation, and I was that's what I was bringing. But I could see why I was greeted as a person who was destroying the community.
But did you see good changes in the students, in the kids? So
Uh,
you were there for a year. maybe.
until I left and they made me feel terrible. It was true that well, you know, it was interesting because and because I wasn't actually there to turn them all into a bunch of liberal atheists, because I was really just there to teach them critical thinking skills and to teach them you know, political analysis and you know, to have the kind of perspective that I brought to here. They value that, right? And that's exactly one of the reasons why parents are suspicious of people like me. So here's the story about Mississippi that always gets me. There was one bookstore in the town. It was Columbus, Mississippi. One bookstore in the town. And when I first went into the bookstore, there was a big display, as there are in bookstores when you first walk in. And the display was a giant table and a cardboard display full of books called How to Stay Christian in College. And you know, I didn't ever pick it up. I should have actually bought a copy. I should still have a copy. Actually, now that I'm saying it, I feel like a jerk for not buying it, because I should know what it said. But to me, I was like, it was a greeting. It was saying how to keep your mind closed real tightly and survive college without those liberal atheistic devils from the north destroying you. And like, I saw that as a sign of unwelcome. But I now, as I say, it was a sign of unwelcome. But I also now see it as a sign of suffering and pain and anguish and uncertainty about like what is going to happen when my kids go to college and start letting this guy fill their brain full of God knows what he's going to fill their brains with, right? You know, we all do represent a threat to other people's established communities and established lifestyles. And you know, I would like to think that I don't react that way. But I have kids, and there are things that if had happened to them, I would have armored up and fought against it. I feel pretty lucky that I got to raise them in a place where I didn't actually have to ride into battle to fight the threats to them, and that makes me feel very privileged too. That's a way. That's something that I haven't had to face that form of uncertainty and suffering. Though my son is about to go away to college, and I'm sure that he's going to have his mind destroyed by all of the atheistic devils or whatever it is. What do professors do to people anyway? I don't even know. Actually, I do know. Okay, he's giving me the time. Thank you.
We're so grateful to have you in our community and speaking to us. So please, thank you.
Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it.